Welcome to the Deep Dive. This week, we're really going to dig into a conflict that's, well, escalated quite dramatically recently, the intensifying situation between Israel and Iran.
We've seen this troubling trade of rockets and drones.
Exactly. And sadly, hundreds of civilian casualties. The impact is just rippling out across the globe.
It really is. It's a critical moment. And for this deep dive, we want to tackle a question that maybe gets a bit lost in the day-to-day headlines. How exactly does Russia fit into this incredibly complex, escalating dynamic?
Yeah, that's the core question we're unpacking today. Our mission, really, is to give you a clear, concise understanding of Russia's role here, which is often, frankly, quite contradictory.
It is. We'll look at that strategic partnership with Iran, what that actually means.
Right. And also its delicate but still very real ties with Israel, and how this whole regional mess connects to something bigger our sources are calling the adversary entente.
Which is, this sort of pragmatic alignment between powers like Russia, China, North Korea.
United more by, say, pushing back against U.S. influence than any deep shared ideology. We've pulled out the key insights, some surprising facts too, so you feel informed, but not, totally overwhelmed. Let's dive in.
Okay, so to really get Russia's involvement, we first need to be super clear about its relationship with Iran. It gets called a strategic partnership, but the nuance here is absolutely vital.
Right, because words matter in geopolitics.
They do. Moscow and Tehran, they did formalize this strategic partnership agreement. That was back in January 2025. But, and this is the key part, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Rudenko, he explicitly stated it does not mean the establishment of a military alliance with Iran or mutual military assistance.
Okay, so strategic partnership definitely doesn't equal military alliance. They're not treaty-bound to jump in if the other gets attacked.
Exactly. No NATO Article 5 situation here.
So how does that basic distinction, fundamentally shape Russia's actions in this conflict? What does it tell us about the real nature of the Russia-Iran relationship?
Well, that distinction is everything, really. Unlike a traditional alliance, this partnership with Iran, it's driven purely by overlapping self-interests, often temporary ones.
Transactional, maybe.
Very transactional. There's no obligation for mutual military support.
Yeah.
And that's a big reason why Russia isn't offering direct military aid to Iran right now, even with things escalating.
Okay, so what's stopping them? Is it just that lack of obligation?
That's part of it. But the primary constraint, honestly, is the ongoing war in Ukraine. Experts we looked at, like Hananote and Ruslan Suleimanov, they're quite clear on this. Russia's just tied up in Ukraine.
Right.
They cannot afford to redirect personnel or arms somewhere else. Their resources are, frankly, stretched incredibly thin.
So their military capacity, their money, it's all just focused on Ukraine. That makes sense. But doesn't that limitation affect their willingness or even their ability to project power elsewhere, especially in a flashpoint like the Middle East? And isn't there also this question about Russia's reputation?
Yeah.
As a reliable partner, our sources mentioned that perception back in December 2024, that they didn't fully back Bashar al-Assad. How did that specifically undermine their credibility? Does it play into this reluctance now?
It definitely does. That whole situation with Assad, the perception was they didn't go all the way. It raised real questions about how reliable they are when the ships are down.
Okay.
And add to that, there's this pretty strong perception that Russia's own air defense systems haven't exactly covered themselves in glory in Ukraine. They've been, as one source put it, routinely humiliated. So going up directly against, advanced Western and Israeli air power, that's an incredibly risky move for Moscow. It could potentially expose even more weaknesses in their tech and just compound the damage to their reputation.
So why risk it, basically? Why risk more losses or embarrassment when they're already facing huge challenges in Ukraine? It sounds like this points to a real asymmetry in the relationship now.
It does.
Our sources were pretty blunt. Iran now needs Russia more than Russia needs Iran.
That sums it up nicely. And this asymmetry, it really dictates how Russia does support Iran, which is mainly diplomatically, not militarily.
Okay, so how does that diplomatic support look in practice?
Well, experts point to international bodies, places like the UN Security Council, the IAEA, that's the UN's nuclear watchdog.
Right, where Russia has a permanent seat and veto power.
Exactly. They have significant leverage there, especially that veto.
And we've seen them use it, haven't we? There was that example where Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution. It condemned Iran for supposedly violating an arms embargo on Yemen.
Correct. Russia blocked it, arguing the evidence against Iran was, quote, inconclusive and fabricated. It's a very direct diplomatic cover on the world stage.
Definitely. So diplomatic blocking is one tool. What else?
Well, interestingly, Vladimir Putin himself has offered to mediate talks between Israel and Iran. He's apparently had calls with both Benjamin Netanyahu and Masoud Pezeshkian.
Mediation. Is that genuine peacemaking? Or is there another angle?
Well, the analysis we read suggests it's not purely altruistic. Putin likely uses these offers to present himself to U.S. President Donald Trump as a peacemaker.
Yeah.
It's potentially a way to try and improve U.S.-Russia relations, maybe get some concessions related to the war in Ukraine. It's a pattern we've seen before, using diplomacy for self-serving ends.
So it's less about Middle East peace and more about kind of strategic positioning vis-a-vis the U.S., using this crisis to try and gain leverage on the Ukraine front. That's quite the geopolitical game.
It is. And one more thing on support. The sources also mentioned that both Russia and China are reportedly supplying Iran with operational intelligence.
Okay, so not boots on the ground or weapon systems, but intelligence, which can still be incredibly useful in a conflict, obviously.
Absolutely. That intel sharing is significant. But it also brings up this question of self-sufficiency, especially around drones. For a long time, Russia really leaned heavily on those Iranian drones in Ukraine.
The Shaheds, yeah.
Right. But our sources show a pretty dramatic shift there, one that actually changes Iran's leverage quite a bit. What's the latest on the drone story?
Okay, this was one of the really surprising things we found. You know, we hear constantly about Russia needing Iranian drones, but that narrative might be getting a bit outdated.
How so?
The sources highlight that Russia has, quote, largely taken over production of these Iranian-designed Shahed drones, the ones they call Garans. This has been happening since 2023.
Taken over production, meaning they're building them themselves.
Exactly. They're now reportedly capable of producing up to 2,700 drones per month without Iranian support. That's a huge number. Ukrainian intelligence, back in May 2025, estimated Russia was making about 170 Shahed types a month, aiming for 190 by the end of this year.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just assembling kits from Iran anymore. This is a major domestic production effort.
It seems so. A massive ramp up.
And that drastically changes the whole equation, doesn't it? It means Russia is also less reliant on, say, missile shipments from partners, too. They've reportedly stockpiled upwards of 13,000 missiles of various types as of May 2025.
13,000 missiles.
Yeah. So while Israeli strikes might be hitting Iranian missile sites, potentially hurting Iran's ability to give ballistic missiles to Russia,
right,
the overall hit to Russia's own defense industry is expected to be minimal because they're increasingly making what they need themselves. Indigenization, basically.
So even if Iran's supply lines get disrupted by Israeli actions, Russia's kind of built its own internal factory for these crucial drones, and they have massive missile stockpiles. That's a huge strategic shift. It really lessens Iran's leverage over Moscow.
Definitely.
And this whole situation, ironically maybe, often seems to create economic opportunities for Russia, right? Instability in the Middle East can actually work to Moscow's advantage financially.
It certainly can. There's a direct, almost immediate economic benefit. A prolonged conflict between Iran and Israel, it can cause a spike in global energy prices.
Which means more money for Russia's state budget.
Exactly. It provides a nice short-term boost to Russia's budget revenue.
Yeah.
We saw a clear example. Brent oil prices jumped almost 10% one Monday, went from about $67 to over $73 a barrel, purely because of the escalation fears.
That's a very tangible gain for Russia. Their coffers get padded while things heat up elsewhere. But it's not just about the immediate price spike, is it? The sources mention something about the Iran nuclear deal.
Right. Any complications in reaching a deal on Iran's nuclear program, which this conflict certainly creates, that also benefits Moscow? Why? Because it further delays the entry of Iranian oil and gas into the global and, in particular, European markets.
Delaying the competition. Russia's quite happy not to have Iranian energy flooding the European market they used to dominate.
Precisely. It keeps a potential major competitor sidelined. And there's another angle. China. China buys a huge amount of Iranian oil, like 90% of Iran's exports. If those Iranian supplies get disrupted or decline because of the conflict,
China needs to buy oil from somewhere else.
Exactly. And they could well turn to Russian oil, which would be very timely for Russia, especially since their own oil and gas revenues have shrunk because of Western sanctions.
So Russia potentially benefits from higher prices or from gaining China as an even bigger customer if Iranian supply drops. Sounds like a win-win economically, at least in the short term.
You can look that way.
But are analysts really convinced this boost will last? Or is it maybe just a temporary blip?
That's the counterargument. Not everyone is convinced it's a long-term windfall. Many analysts actually doubt that a large-scale disruption to the energy markets will happen.
Why is that?
They predict any price hike would likely be temporary. The main reason, there's still substantial excess oil production capacity in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, UAE. They can ramp up production to offset disruptions elsewhere.
Okay, so the global market has some shock absorbers built in. So maybe a short-term gain for Russia, but perhaps not a fundamental long-term shift in energy market.
That's what many analysts think, yes.
Okay, that's an important reality check. Now, let's shift gears slightly to something that might surprise a lot of listeners. Russia's relationship with Israel. Despite this strategic partnership with Iran, despite criticizing Israeli strikes, the analysis suggests this escalating conflict is unlikely to affect Russia's relationship with Israel. That feels counterintuitive. Given how deeply opposed Israel and Iran are, how does Moscow pull off this balancing act?
It does seem counterintuitive on the surface, but Moscow somehow maintains ties with both. As the sources say, these relationships are far from black and white.
So it's not a zero-sum game for them?
Apparently not. What's really striking is that Russia and Israel have kept relations stable even while Russia was, deepening its ties with Hamas in recent years.
That is remarkable.
And look at it from the other side. Israel hasn't broken off relations with Russia. They haven't imposed sanctions over Ukraine or anything else, really.
So beneath all the geopolitical noise and shifting alliances, there's this surprisingly consistent, pragmatic connection between Moscow and Tel Aviv. What's underpinning that? What are the deeper reasons for this stability when so many others have picked sides?
Well, one significant factor, and it's often overlooked, is demography. There's a very large Russian-speaking population in Israel. Many are dual citizens.
Really? How large?
Some estimates suggest as much as 30% of Israel's population is ethnic Russia. And Putin apparently takes into consideration this population when deciding Russia's stance and actions.
30%. Wow. Okay, that adds a whole different layer. It's not just state-to-state relations. There's a significant people-to-people connection, a diaspora factor.
Exactly. It provides this unique human link that Moscow is clearly very careful not to damage. It acts as a kind of quiet but pretty powerful stabilizer in their relationship.
That's a fascinating detail, actually. Okay, so pulling back to the bigger picture again. How do Russia's moves here, this balancing act, fit into that larger adversary entente? We mentioned earlier, like sort of loose alignment with China, North Korea.
Yeah, this is where you see the global ripples.
Yeah.
Russia, China, North Korea. These powers that often find themselves opposing the U.S., they're absolutely watching and learning from international reactions to the Israel-Iran war.
Learning what, specifically?
Well, they're studying how the West responds, how international bodies react, where the red lines are or aren't. They're using it to shape their own planning for potential conflicts or aggression in their own neighborhoods, their own peripheries. It's like a real-time geopolitical case study for them.
So they're watching Western resolve, Western actions, Western divisions, perhaps?
Yeah.
And taking notes?
Meticulously, you'd imagine. Now, China's role here is also interesting. Like Russia, they condemned the Israeli strikes. They called for diplomacy. It's a similar balancing act for Beijing. They're trying to, balance between appearing to promote international law while also maintaining good relations with Iran and other regional allies.
Right. But China also has its own expanding interests, particularly in Central Asia, potentially competing with Russia there.
Oh, definitely. China's influence in Central Asia is growing significantly. They've signed a treaty of permanent good neighborliness and friendly cooperation, plus various bilateral deals.
Any examples?
Yeah, a really telling one. Kazakhstan is buying its first nuclear power plants from both Russia's Rosatom and China's CNNC.
Both. Okay, that perfectly illustrates how these Central Asian countries are trying to play Russia and China off each other, right? Yeah. Balancing between the two big powers next door.
Exactly. Hedging their bets, diversifying, and it really highlights how China's expansion there capitalizes on Russia's degraded international reputation and influence due to the war in Ukraine. Russia being bogged down opens doors for China.
A clear sign of shifting power dynamics in Russia's traditional backyard. And what about the third member of this loose entente, North Korea?
Their ties with Russia are also getting closer. We're seeing an expansion of road, rail, and air links between them. Officially, it's for civilian cooperation.
Civilian cooperation, but with other implications.
Well, it allows North Korea to send way more workers to Russia. The plan is for about 28,000 workers, and 24,200 of those are slated to go to Russia. That brings in hard currency for Pyongyang.
Which they can use
For anything, including funding their military and, critically, their nuclear programs. And, as we know from other reporting, these links almost certainly serve as a channel for North Korea to supply Russia with badly needed ammunition for the Ukraine war.
Got it. So this adversary entente, it's not some formal, ideologically driven bloc like the old Cold War days. It's much looser, more pragmatic, a network of states learning from each other, doing deals, exploiting instability, all for their own, often quite different self-interests.
That really captures it. What keeps coming through is how Russia's actions in the Israel-Iran situation are driven by this pragmatic, self-interested calculus. They're constantly balancing relationships, even conflicting ones. They're leveraging instability where they can, especially as it relates back to their main priority, Ukraine.
Operating less like a traditional loyal ally and more like a transactional player, always weighing the immediate costs and benefits.
Exactly.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you, our listeners? This deep dive, it really paints a picture of a global landscape where even so-called strategic partners put their own self-interest, their economic gains, way ahead of things like direct military aid or ideological solidarity.
Yeah, it's much more about these complex, fluid transactional relationships. They're constantly being tweaked based on immediate needs and opportunities.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something provocative for you to consider. How do these shifting alliances, this very transactional nature of power politics we're seeing, how does that reshape our whole understanding of international security, of the potential for future conflicts?
And what does it mean for stability in key regions, for global markets in the coming years, when self-interest seems to be the primary driver, much more so than any shared values or ideology? That's really something worth mulling over as we watch these complex, interconnected challenges continue to unfold.